In the 16th century, Spain was the most powerful empire on earth. Its ships brought tons of silver from the mines of Potosí, in present-day Bolivia, and from Mexico. Spain was, literally, the richest country in the world. And yet, the Spanish could buy less and less. Prices in Spain multiplied by 4 in 100 years. Bread, meat, clothing, everything kept rising. Wages did not keep up. And that formidable empire, flooded with silver, began to crumble from within. Charles I declared bankruptcy. Philip II declared it 3 times. What had happened? Something that today has a very well-known name. Inflation. Too much silver chasing the same goods. Money was abundant, but the things you could buy with it had not increased. And when there is more money than goods, prices rise. It is one of the most destructive forces in the economy. And today we are going to understand how it works. In previous episodes we have seen what interest is and how central banks use it to manage the economy. But manage what exactly? Their main enemy has a name: inflation. Inflation is the generalized and sustained rise in prices. It is not that one product goes up in price. It is that almost everything goes up. And when that happens, every euro in your pocket buys a little less than before. Today we are going to see what causes inflation, how it is measured, who wins, who loses, and why economists have been arguing about it for centuries. Before understanding what causes inflation, we need to know how it is measured. Because it is not enough to say prices are rising. You have to quantify it. The most common method is called the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. It works like this. The statistical agencies of each country define a shopping basket that represents what a typical household consumes: bread, milk, petrol, rent, clothing, electricity, transport, leisure. Hundreds of products and services, each weighted proportionally to what people spend on it. Each month, statisticians record the prices of those products in thousands of shops across the country. And they compare. If the basket cost €1,000 last year and €1,030 this year, inflation is 3%. It is an imperfect system. Your personal inflation can be very different from the average. If you do not own a car, petrol does not matter to you. If you are a renter, housing weighs enormously in your budget. But the CPI is the best tool we have for measuring how prices change overall. In the United States, another indicator called PCE is also used, the Personal Consumption Expenditures Index, which is the Federal Reserve's preferred measure because it adjusts automatically when people change their consumption habits. If chicken becomes much more expensive and people buy more pork, the PCE captures that. The CPI does not always. In 1752, the Scottish philosopher David Hume observed something that seemed obvious but that nobody had formalized. When a lot of new money enters an economy, prices rise. 2 centuries later, this observation became one of the most famous equations in economics. It is written like this: M times V equals P times Q. Do not be intimidated. It is simpler than it looks. M is the quantity of money in circulation. V is the velocity of money, meaning how many times each monetary unit changes hands in a given period. P is the general price level. And Q is the quantity of goods and services produced. What the equation says is this: the money in the economy, multiplied by how quickly it circulates, equals the total value of what is produced. If the quantity of money rises a lot but production does not change, prices have to rise. It is an accounting identity. And it is exactly what happened in 16th century Spain. American silver increased enormously. V remained more or less stable. Q did not grow at the same pace. So P skyrocketed. In 1963, Milton Friedman uttered his most famous phrase: inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. What he meant is that inflation can only be sustained if the quantity of money grows faster than production. It is a potent claim. And in many historical cases, it is correct. But not always. Economists distinguish at least 3 different mechanisms that can generate inflation. The first is demand-pull inflation. It occurs when there is too much money chasing too few goods. People want to buy more than the economy can produce. Sellers raise prices because they can. It is the classic mechanism, the one the equation describes. The second is cost-push inflation. It occurs when the cost of producing things rises. If oil becomes more expensive, transport becomes more expensive. If transport becomes more expensive, everything that is transported becomes more expensive. Companies pass that cost on to the final price. This is exactly what happened in the 1970s. In 1973, the oil-producing countries of OPEC cut supply and multiplied the price of crude. Inflation shot up across the industrialist world. But not because there was too much money. Because an essential resource had become brutally more expensive. This case challenges Friedman's claim. The inflation of the 70s was not purely monetary. It was a supply shock. And it forced economists to rethink their models. The third type is built-in or inertial inflation. It occurs when people expect inflation and act accordingly. Workers demand wage increases to compensate for the inflation they expect. Companies raise prices to cover those higher wages. And inflation feeds on itself. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. In practice, real inflation is usually a mixture of all three. But the distinction matters, because each type requires a different response. Demand pull inflation is fought by raising interest rates. Cost push inflation is not so easily solved. And inertial inflation requires something much harder, changing the expectations of millions of people. All of this stopped being theory in 2021. After the pandemic, inflation returned forcefully to Western economies after decades of stable prices. In the United States, it reached 9.1% in June 2022. In the Eurozone, 10.6% in October of the same year. Figures not seen since the 1980s. And economists split into three camps that reflected exactly the three types of inflation. The monetarists pointed to the enormous monetary expansion during the pandemic. Governments spent trillions on stimulus. Central banks printed money at unprecedented levels. For the monetarists, the equation was clear: too much money, inflation inevitable. The Keynesians pointed to the bottlenecks in supply chains. Factories closed during the pandemic. Containers got stuck in ports. Microchip production collapsed. For the Keynesians, the problem was not too much money, but too little supply. And the structuralists added another factor: market power. In concentrated sectors, with few dominant companies, firms could raise prices beyond what their costs justified, using the inflationary environment as cover. Who was right? Probably all of them, in part. Post-pandemic inflation was a complex phenomenon where excess money, supply shortages, rising energy prices, and corporate power all converged. It could not be explained with a single theory. And that is something to remember whenever you hear someone claim they know exactly what causes inflation. The honest answer is usually, it depends. Inflation does not affect everyone equally. And this inequality is one of its most damaging effects. Savers lose. If you have money in the bank at 1% and inflation is 5%, your savings lose purchasing power every day. Without lifting a finger, each year you are a little poorer in real terms. People on fixed incomes lose even more. Retirees whose pensions are not adjusted for inflation buy less with each passing month. Workers whose wages do not rise in line with prices see their standard of living silently eroded. The poorest suffer proportionally more. Because food, energy, and housing, the basic expenses, tend to be the ones that rise most. And families with lower incomes dedicate a much larger percentage of their budget to these essential expenses. In contrast, debtors can benefit. If you have a fixed-rate mortgage and inflation rises, you are repaying money that is worth less than what you borrowed. Your real debt shrinks. And owners of assets, homes, shares, commodities typically see the value of their possessions rise with inflation, while the value of money falls. Inflation is, in essence, an invisible tax. No parliament approves it. It appears in no law. But it redistributes wealth from savers to debtors, from the poor to the rich, from those on fixed incomes to those who own assets. 3 ideas to take away from this episode. First, inflation is the generalized and sustained rise in prices. It is measured with the CPI, a basket of products whose cost is compared year on year. Second, there are at least 3 causes of inflation: excess demand, rising costs, and self-reinforcing expectations. Friedman's phrase that inflation is always a monetary phenomenon is powerful but incomplete. The inflation of the 70s and of 2021 showed that reality is more complex. Third, inflation is not neutral. It hurts savers, pensioners, the poor. It benefits debtors and asset owners. It is an invisible tax that redistributes wealth without anyone voting for it. Inflation is a problem everyone knows about. But there is a quieter, less understood threat that some economists consider even more dangerous. What happens when prices, instead of rising, start to fall? Sounds good, does it not? Lower prices. Who does not like that? Well, it turns out that for economies it can be devastating. Japan discovered this in the worst possible way. That, next time.